Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your psychology instructor, and in this mini lecture we're going to talk about learning theory and 3 types of learning. So our author gives us a pretty complex definition of learning. They say learning is the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information and behaviors. Now, that's not normally what we think of when we think of learning. Usually, when students think of learning, they think of what happens in the classroom. But that's not how psychologists think of learning. The primary way we learn is through experience, and not experience in the classroom, but experience out in the real world. The real world is truly our teacher and where we acquire most of what we know. So, new and relatively enduring. So this is how we gain new knowledge. And when they say relatively enduring, we mean that not everything we learn is permanent. We can forget some things. Most of it we remember, or we remember sort of, but it's relatively enduring. And that's why we put this chapter and the next chapter, the chapter on memory, together, because learning and memory go hand in hand. And you'll see just how horrible it is in the memory chapter when we have somebody who can learn, but they can't remember anything. So, the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information and behaviors. So it's not just what we know, it's not just what we do, but it's both. It's both acquiring new behaviors and gaining knowledge. So that's our definition of learning. And if you think back to our discussion at the beginning of the semester, learning theory was one of the perspectives we looked at. We called it the behavioral perspective. Okay, so let's take a look at your brain again. If you remember from a previous module, we took a look at the brain, and this, the cerebrum, is where learning occurs. When we think of learning in acquiring knowledge, this is where learning occurs. And unlike lower animals that are more based on instinctual behavior, we as humans, because we have such big brains, because we have so many folds in our brains, we can acquire a lot of new knowledge through experience. We don't have nearly as many instinctual behaviors as animals do. One of the concepts I need you to remember as we go through classical conditioning and operant conditioning and observational learning is that when we use the word conditioning, you can substitute that word for learning. So learning equals conditioning. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 types of learning in this chapter. The first type is called classical conditioning, and this is learning of involuntary responses. If you can remember that classical conditioning only deals with involuntary responses, it's going to save you a letter grade or 2 on your next test, because a lot of students like to confuse voluntary responses with classical conditioning, and classical conditioning only deals with involuntary responses, and we'll go into that in detail. Going back to our chapter on the brain and the rest of the nervous system, when we're talking about classical conditioning, we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, the nervous system that runs on its own without us having to think about it. And a person you've probably heard of before, we'll be talking about a guy by the name of Ivan Pavlov and his famous dogs, and he is the father of classical conditioning. So again, remember, classical conditioning only deals with involuntary responses. After that, we'll move on to operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is the learning of voluntary behaviors. So coming to school, Going to work, studying, gaming, all of those are voluntary behaviors, things you choose to do or choose not to do. Those are examples of behaviors that would be operantly conditioned. And we're talking about the somatic nervous system here. If you remember from our discussion of the nervous system, the somatic division of the nervous system is the voluntary side. And the father of operant conditioning is a guy by the name of B.F. Skinner. You'll always recognize B.F. Skinner in pictures because he has what I call the world's biggest forehead. Very, very intelligent person, and he's the father of operant conditioning. He and his famous laboratory rats. At the end of this chapter, we'll move on to observational learning, and this is learning by watching others. So watching other people, or in the case of animals, watching other animals and seeing the consequences to their behavior. And the father of observational learning is a guy by the name of Albert Bandura. So those are the three types of learning we're going to be looking at in this chapter: classical conditioning, involuntary responses; operant conditioning, voluntary responses; and observational learning, learning by watching others. And again, remember that learning equals conditioning.